All right, well, welcome to another episode of the Pastor's Roundtable. I am your host, Ryan Latham, and I'm here with my friend, Troy Singleterry. Troy is the lead pastor of City View Church here in San Diego, California, suffering for Jesus.
Yes.
Suffering for Jesus here in San Diego. We just got done with some staff training, and I thought it would be fun to sit down and talk with you a little bit about your ministry journey and just what's going on in ministry now and help us out with just kind of some tips, things like that for the future. So let me tell you a little bit about Troy. Troy and I, Troy was actually my boss and, a good friend. He was my supervisor, my boss for about 4.5 years, and great leader, great vision, great passion, and loves good food.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. There's nothing like a good taco. The Bible says, taste and see the Lord is good, and I think he's referring to Mexican food.
Absolutely. There's going to be Mexican food in heaven.
There will be horchata.
That's right. Well, Troy, tell us just a little bit about your ministry journey.
Well, I've been in ministry full-time for probably about 28 years, and started off as an intern in Fremont at Fremont First Assembly, and was still going to Bethany College at that time in Santa Cruz. So my senior year, I was commuting, being an associate, doing Sundays primarily on the weekends, and then from there, the pastor ended up saying, "Hey, I want you to do junior high." So we were able to get on staff there as the junior high pastors. And my wife and I at that time weren't married; we were engaged to be married. And then our pastor ended up becoming the senior pastor at Lancaster First Assembly. And because the pastor who was there went to the district office to be the treasurer, secretary treasurer, and so he said, "Hey, if I'm going to come, I have a children's pastor. I want to bring in a couple that's about to be youth pastors." So we ended up getting married, went to Maui, came back, and loaded up a little U-Haul, and ended up going from the Bay Area to the high desert, where they had a lot of beach, just no water. And so
I believe that was your selling pitch when you were interviewing me.
yes,
Was that
yes,
the beach?
got a lot of beach, just no water. And so we were there for 4.5 wonderful, or 5.5, almost 5 years, from 94 to 99. And then the Lord ended up taking us to Portland, Oregon, where we did high school and college. And we were there for 3 years and went there and, went from the brown to the green, from no rain to rain. And instead of tanning, I rusted from all the rain. And we were there for 3 years. And then the Lord brought us back to the Holy Land of Southern California. And we were doing high school only at a wonderful church in Bakersfield at Canyon Hills. And then there was a time in my 14 years of working with young people that I knew that there was going to be a transition from being a youth pastor to a lead pastor. And I knew that in that process there was going to be something that was going to help develop me for that. And two dear friends called me that they were looking for an executive pastor. And I think a lot of people thought I was going to go with my other friend down in the Corona area to be his executive pastor for his wonderful, thriving church. And then there was where I was the youth pastor at Lancaster to go back and be there. So I think a lot of people in the natural thought, oh, he's going to go to Corona. He's not going to Lancaster. But sometimes our ways aren't his ways and our thoughts aren't his thoughts. And the Lord ended up telling us to go back to Lancaster. And so we went back in 2006. And that was the transition of being in youth ministry for almost 15 years to now being an executive pastor. And I remember my pastor telling me, this is the closest you're going to be to being a lead pastor just without the title. And the ultimate desire was, he was getting up in age. And so there was maybe a succession plan to say, hey, when I go off into the sunset, you'll take over because you were the youth pastor and, you've been the executive pastor for X amount of years. And so it'll be a smooth transition for that to happen. So, that was the ultimate goal for what we thought was going to happen. But again, God had a different plan. And, we'll unpack that in a second. But
we'll get back into that.
That's the journey. And then, of course, in 2015, the Lord brought us to San Diego. And I remember when I was in...
Now, how much time did you have to pray about coming to San Diego to be a lead pastor? Let's be honest.
Well, I remember when I was a senior in high school, senior in college at Bethany, we did our senior trip here to San Diego, and I was on the shores of La Jolla. And, I was my feet were in the water, and I was just looking at the beach and the scenery. And I said this, I'll never forget it. I said, Lord, if you ever call us to San Diego, I will not say no. And who would have ever thought that 20?
Maybe I need to be. That's what I need to be praying. I need to change my prayer life.
And so maybe that was why, it's 23 years later, because we've been here almost 5 years, that the Lord ended up remembering that prayer that I said. So be careful what you pray for wherever you're at.
Or don't be careful.
Yeah,
you can be praying the right thing.
that's true.
So let's talk about. You are pretty controversial in the fact that you're a Spurs fan.
Yes, diehard. And now I'm praying for Pop. I don't know what's happened to him, but he seems to sometimes focus more on politics than he does on basketball. But I love the Spurs. I was born in San Antonio, so a lot of people I know, especially whether they're OKC or Laker, they're like, "What the heck are you doing living here? In California, rooting for some team that's not even relevant." But you know what? There's always got to be an oddball in the
now,
picture.
The connection is that you were born in the area, right?
Yes. Yeah, so I was born in San Antonio, so how the Lord even brought me to California was a miracle, because I was going to Southwestern Assemblies of God in Waxahachie, and I went to San Antonio College to get basics, and then I was planning to go back. But then the Lord opened a door for me to go to Bethany, and I had never been to California in my life. I was in Texas, our state bird, the mosquito, the whole 9 yards, and then the Lord ended up giving me an opportunity to see California.
Okay, so by the way, you joke about that.
Yes.
But I was in Katy, Texas, and their minor league baseball team is the Skeeters. so the mascot is the mosquito.
Oh yeah, man.
So I mean, you joke about it, but it's pretty real.
Yeah, I think our state bird in Texas is the hummingbird or something. I can't remember what it is, but
no, it's the mosquito.
It is the mosquito. There's no doubt about it. So coming from Texas to California, which I'd never been to, I mean, I was like, oh my gosh, I don't have humidity. There's no chicharrones or, the locusts at night, that make those crazy sounds, or during the day. And there's no humidity and no mosquitoes. And I'd never been to Northern California, just fell in love with, Santa Cruz and all that stuff. And so that was my desire to go to Bethany. But my dad didn't end up getting a loan, and so I didn't think I was going to be able to go. But God made a way for me where there seemed to be no way. And I ended up at Bethany in 92. And I've been on the West Coast since. My mom is like, my son went to Bible college, and he's not back with me anymore. So, but again, I would have never thought that I would be out on the West Coast, but the Lord brought me here, met my wife, and 28 plus years later in ministry, and 25 plus years of marriage, we have 4 kids, and always wanted to have 2 and adopt 2, and the Lord gave us that. And
That's awesome.
I'll share more about that later.
That's great. So I want to come back to more controversial subjects. So you're in San Diego, and you were in LA for a long time.
In the LA County, yeah.
But you somehow are a 49ers fan, right?
No. Teresa's a 49ers fan.
Oh.
I'm a Steelers fan.
Steelers.
I know. People were like, how can you be from Texas?
Okay, what's going on?
Well, in the 70s, everyone in my family was either a Cowboys fan or an Oilers fan. And what ended up happening was I just fell in love with the silver and black. And everyone thought I was dropped as a baby, because it's like, how can you not be a Cowboys or an Oilers fan? But I just wanted to be a rebel with the cause. And, of course, that was a good time to be a Steelers fan in the 70s, because they won 4 Super Bowls.
Yeah.
And
I think it was because you were the fan.
Maybe. I don't know. Maybe the Mexican leprechaun or something like that. So.
Okay, so let's jump back to, we talked, you talked a little bit about the succession plan. Okay, so I think when I think about Troy, I think that there's something about your loyalty, your faithfulness. A lot of people talk about being under spiritual authority and spiritual covering, and you went back with a good idea of a succession plan, and that plan didn't quite work out as maybe you had thought, or maybe they had thought, but you stayed loyal. You stayed committed to it. You stayed committed to the pastor. You stayed committed to the church. You stayed committed. Just talk about that journey. What was that like? What have you learned from that?
Well, I think, when you're in the ministry, it comes down to 2 things. Is it a call or a career? And for me, it's always been a call. I mean, even before I was born out of wedlock. My mom was already a single woman when she met my dad, and they found out that she was pregnant, and there was really no understanding if they were going to get married. There was no really desire to maybe even get married, and so they decided, we need to just abort this child, because my mom was already a single mom with one child, and she didn't want to be a single mom with two children without a father. So my mom had a friend who knew how to do what needed to be done, and she was on the bed for the surgery to be done, or for the abortion to be done, I should say. And my mom was a religious woman. She believed in God. She was raised Catholic. She just didn't have that relationship with the Lord. But the Lord spoke to her and said, "Thou shalt not kill. I'm going to use this child for my glory." And she looked at her friend who was getting ready to do what needed to be done, and she said to her friend, "What did you say?" And she goes, "I didn't say anything." And again, the Lord spoke to my mom again. And so she said, "You know what? I need to leave this place, and I need to remove myself from this room, because I'm not going to do this." And so she told my father. Eventually they got married. They've been married now for over 48 years. And so growing up, my mom used to always call me an evangelist, a preacher, and I hated it because I didn't want to be that. I grew up with aspirations of being a race car driver, and then a fireman, and then a lawyer, and nothing wrong with those things, but I just got to the point where I realized, you know what? Going into my senior year of high school, I went to a Christian camp, and I realized he died for me. I want to live for him. And I remember telling my mom and dad, I feel called to the ministry. And I remember growing up, my mom would, there was times where I really loved the Lord and was growing in my faith, and I would remember sometimes preaching to my stuffed animals. And, even, all these years later, sometimes I still feel like I'm preaching to stuffed animals. But I remember baptizing my stuffed animals in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, doing all sorts of different things. And I was, at one point when we were Catholic, I thought, okay, I'm going to be a priest. But I didn't know priests couldn't get married. I just said, homie ain't playing that game. So,
that's not for me.
I ended up, eventually when we became, started to go to Christian church, non-denom, and then I grew in my faith, I realized, you know what, I feel a call of God. And then that's when my parents told me what I just told you, that they never told me while I was growing up. So I thought it was just some image that she had in her mind and just some dream or fantasy, but she had something that she knew that I didn't even know in my life. And so I always grew up dealing with rejection and low self-esteem, and I wondered why I was even born. But the Lord, I think even before I was born, there was already like a spirit of rejection on me. And somehow, some way, God turned that around going into my senior year of high school and started developing things in me that I think had I been confident and been like, I believe in myself, I would have done things that probably I should have never done. But the Lord protected me in that season. What ended up happening was I felt the call of God. And so as I went back to Lancaster with this idea and this notion that, hey, this would be the ultimate goal if that was his dream, my dream, because of all the years that I'd been there, the people knew me, that would be great. And but days turned to weeks, weeks turned to months, months turned to years, and things didn't come to fruition. But even in that process of going back to Lancaster, the market crashed in 2006. We put our home on the market in Bakersfield. We ended up moving 5 times in 10 months with me and my wife and our 2 kids and a dog, a yellow lab named Daisy, and yet we're still trying to sell this house in Bakersfield. Well, the house finally sells a year later, and my wife got a teaching job just right when we ended up going back to Lancaster. So we decided, okay, we'll put our house on the market. We'll have someone live in it. We'll move into someone else's house that's not living in theirs. And, but in the midst of that, they ended up moving back. And then we moved, like I said, 5 times in 10 months. And so we finally sold the house, put money down. And then on our daughter's birthday, May 11th, which we took everything even out of our house. And what ended up happening was the whole deal went south on our daughter's birthday. So what happened was it was one of those most devastating things that we were just weeping and crying, and our pastor of our church came to the home because he could just tell I was just emotionally distraught. Like, we know God's called us here, and we know that this is our desire. Why aren't we moving here? Why is God not moving us to the city that our church is at? So because of the relationship I had with him, and he said something that I'll never forget, sometimes you don't understand the hand of God, but you have to trust the heart of God. And we didn't understand, why did the Lord not want us in the Antelope Valley? Why did the Lord want us to move back to Bakersfield? So we ended up moving back to Bakersfield and developed a commute plan.
Yeah, and how far is that?
It was probably about an hour and 10-minute drive.
Wow.
I remember we bought a Camry hybrid, a Toyota 2007. And when it was all said and done, I put like 260,000 miles on that car. For 9 years, when it was time to go to church, some people complain like, "Oh, I got to get up at 7 to get at church by 9." My wife would get up at 5. I'd get up at 6. We'd get our 2 kids ready. We'd get on the road by 7.
Yeah.
And we did that for 9 years.
Wow.
Thinking of what was going to happen.
Yeah.
But I remember when we moved back to Bakersfield and commuted to Lancaster, our dream was always to have 2 kids and adopt 2 kids. And when we went back, we became foster parents and ended up getting our first child when we moved back and got recertified. And when we got this young man, or this little boy, he went into the system at 5 months. We got him at 14 months, and we were his 10th home. So I don't know what it is with 5 moves in 10 months and a kid that, he experienced, all these moves in 10 months and stuff like that. And so the social worker said, I've never had a teenager move as many times as this kid has moved. So he became a part of our family, and about 17 months later, we adopted him. And then we ended up getting a call about another little boy who was born in Lancaster, where I was working. And my wife said, "Hey, there's the possibility of fostering to adopt, but we need to make a decision." So we had never seen a picture of the kid. We didn't know anything. He was born in Lancaster. And so it was one of those things where it was like, I can't go pick up this kid and bring him home. She goes, no, I'll go get him. Well, it was snowing between Bakersfield and Lancaster. There's Tehachapi, and sometimes they shut the 58 down. But she says, I'll go and get him. She went and got him. And we didn't know that he had to be fed every 3 hours. He had some issues that we didn't know about. So, but we took him in. And so, we had this one little boy that we just adopted. We fostered another little boy, and 9 months later, we ended up adopting him. So had the Lord not moved us back to Bakersfield, we would have never gotten those 2 boys. So sometimes when you don't understand the hand of God, you got to trust the heart of God. And and I look back and I think, why didn't God move us to Lancaster, where we were pastoring, where the ultimate goal was for a succession plan? But that's because God had a different plan. And that was to unite us with these 2 boys. And 20 years of marriage and 22 years of overall dating and all that stuff, for 23 years, our dream became a reality. And God gave us 2 kids of our own, and we adopted 2 kids. And so it's one of those things that you look back and you think, had we bought the home that we were going to buy, had those people bought the home that we had in Bakersfield, those 2 boys would have never come into our life.
Yeah, and you'd been praying for 2 boys.
Yeah.
Two adopted.
So it's one of those things that you look back, and even in ministry, there's things that happen that you wonder, why did this happen? Why did God allow us to go through this, or why? And sometimes we ask the wrong question. Instead of why, we should be asking, how are you going to use this, Lord, for your glory and your honor? Oh, there's a purpose behind the pain.
Yeah.
And there's always a purpose behind the pain that you go through. So going through that season, that was one of the miracles. But even then, as days turn to weeks, weeks turn to months, months turn to years, in that process, I always knew in my heart the biggest thing that I can do is not only be called to do what God's called me to do, but called to serve the senior pastor. Even though he gave me incredible flexibility, even though he trusted me, there were times where people would say, "Oh, I wish you would preach more," or "When are you going to do this?" And I never looked at those opportunities to say, "Yeah, you're right," or "I should get this," or "I should do that." I just kept serving God's interest in his vision and his desire for what God wanted to do in the life of the church. Even if it wasn't maybe my vision or my desire, it wasn't about me. It was all about him, and it was all about not only him when I mean him, the Lord, but it was also about serving the person that I was under. Because if you can't submit to authority, then you can never experience if you're not willing to submit to authority, then when it's your time to want that authority, you're never going to get it because you weren't able to do it in the little things.
Yeah.
And I think it's in those little things that God will eventually bless you with the big.
Yeah. And during your time there, you served as like the interim, I think, every single job.
Yeah. I was a children's pastor at one time. I was a youth pastor at one time. I was an intern director at one time. I think I was the women's ministry. No, I'm kidding. But it was funny because I did so
well,
many
but
things.
but like marriage ministry.
Yeah, we did marriage,
You
men's
did men's
ministry.
ministry. You did, I
Yeah.
think, classic. The senior.
Yeah,
you did that
at
for a
some
while.
time. And so, it's funny because when I interned at that church in Fremont, I wanted to work with the youth. They didn't put me to work with the youth till the last month I was there. And I first started doing a first grade Sunday school class. Then they had me work with the seniors. Then they had me work with singles. And I'm thinking, why am I here? I want to work with youth. I didn't work with the youth till the last month I was there, and then they ended up hiring me part-time. If I would have worked with the youth at the beginning, and then they would have done me with all these other things, I probably would have never gotten an offer to be a part-time youth pastor. But again, what I appreciate about the internship I had, it wasn't just what I wanted.
Yeah.
It was they wanted me to be involved and experience the whole church. And because of that, when I went to become an executive pastor, and I went through those seasons of being interim, children's interim, I remember what I went through as that intern, and I felt like it even prepared me for what I did, 16 years later. So
Yeah.
it was a neat experience that I look back and say, wow. And then being an executive pastor, and even though I was a youth pastor at one time, but being back in that fold, or being a children's person, or working with the seniors, it gave me a greater appreciation for those that work in those ministries. That way, when I didn't have to do those things anymore, or now as a lead pastor, you learn to appreciate the nursery worker,
Yeah.
the first grade Sunday school teacher.
Because you know what it's like.
Because you know what it's like. And so sometimes you can only possess what you experience. But when I experienced those seasons of being interim, on top of all these other things that I was doing, on top of commuting, on top of fostering a child, and then adopting, and then fostering another one as a baby, and commuting and doing all that stuff that I did, it's the grace of God that sustained us in the midst of all the uncertainty.
Yeah. So when you look back over the past years of ministry, what would you say to your 25-year-old self
Today,
if you could go back to your
Wow.
25-year-old self? What would you say to yourself?
Oh man, I think I would say don't be secure in who you are in Christ. Because I think a lot of times when we're younger, we feel like we have to show who we are because we don't have all the years of knowledge like some of those that are older. But I think becoming secure, not doing things on your own by yourself, but because I think sometimes in ministry we can make it about the castle and not about the kingdom. And I think the castle is important, but I think the more focused we are on the castle, meaning the church, and not the capital C church, the kingdom, that we can lose sight of that. And I think the reason when you're younger is because of fear. Like, if my people get exposed to their people, they want to go to that church, or my youth group want to go to that because they have this and that. So I think it's one of those things that you just, if I could look back and say, hey, just we're better together. There's power in collaboration. Even though I can't stand the Warriors, I love their motto. There's strength, there's strength in numbers. And so I think being secure in who you are, I think networking, and don't be Han Solo, ministries, but we're better together.
Yeah.
And iron sharpening iron, and I think those are two big things that I wish I could do over again.
Yeah, that's great. So you've already talked about some of the advice that previous mentors have given you, but what's some of the best advice that you've been given?
Well, I think there's a lot of things, but I think wherever you go in ministry or even in the secular world, I think the most important thing is to do what God's called you to do, and to do it with everything you've got. And I think one of the things that I think is important to do is that when you go somewhere, like for me, being a pastor, God calls you to a church. And I think that's important that we're called to a church, but I think we also need to remember that God hasn't just called us to a church, He's called us to a city. And I think it's important that we remember as ministers of the gospel that we are to take care of His flock. We're to build them in their faith, make them influencers for the kingdom of God. But if we don't reach people outside the four walls of the church, then we can become focused more on the castle than the kingdom. And I think if there's anything, it's about, you're not just called to a church, you're called to a city. And what is God calling you to do in that city? whether it's for the people behind your church, around your church, or, you know, a region of the city or whatever it may be, and just say, Lord, what is it that you want me to do for and serve your interest in the lives of people, not only in the church, but how can I get our church to rally around the people that are around the church that need Jesus, how we've received Jesus. So I think to me is make it not just about the church God's called you to, but about the community that he's surrounded you by.
Yeah.
Because if we're not careful, we can become a club more than a hospital. And Jesus came to seek and save that which was lost. He came for the sick. And I think what we have to remind ourselves daily as the body of Christ, as the church, is it's not about us. It's about them.
Yeah.
You know, our motto here at our church is every person counts. And sometimes people can take that for granted. You know, well, since every person counts, then I want this or I want that. And you almost have to make another hashtag. It's not about you. You know, every person counts, but it's not about you. And I think it's one of those things that if we can develop a mind frame around being a healing center, around being a hospital, and hospitals are beautiful. I've been to some super nice hospitals, especially here in San Diego, but no matter how beautiful a hospital is, it's messy.
Yeah.
Because you're dealing with illnesses and disease and sickness, and we've all been tested positive for this thing called SIN, and I think the only thing that's going to deliver us or set us free is the blood of Christ, and how we can bring hope and transformation by being Jesus with skin on, because some of the people in our community, we might be the only Bible they ever read. So how can we serve God's interests in their lives? Maybe it's through kindness, maybe it's through compassion, maybe it's through relationship, because sometimes people want to be connected before they're corrected. And I think the best thing that we can do is see how we can be an extension of Christ to our community. And I think once you do that, you'll start to see your church become a reflection of it. And it seems like everywhere the Lord has taken us, we've seen multi-ethnic happening in our churches, whether we were youth pastors or, you know, had youth leaders, and it looked like the United Nations. And so that's what heaven's going to look like. And so I think that's, to me, is an important thing. And I think another thing is it's a marathon. It's not a race.
Yeah.
You know,
For sure.
There's only so much you can do in a day. And you've got to pace yourself, and you've got to learn to say no. And even when you want to say yes, and even the way you model it with your kids. I always tell my kids I'm going to work. I never have told my kids I'm going to church. The only time I ever tell them I'm going to church is on Wednesday night and on Sunday morning.
Yeah.
And so I always tell them, hey, Dad's going to work. Because if I always tell them I'm going to church, I'm going to church, I'm going to church, I'm going to church, I don't want them to become just despise the church.
Yeah.
So for me, it's like, I think the other thing is you got to learn to have boundaries. And I think you got to learn to separate the two worlds. Even though it is a call, it's not a career, but to be able to explain to people, I'm going to work, but today we're going to church.
Yeah.
So
There's a difference.
Yep, there's a huge difference when you say it that way.
Yeah. So leading your team the last few years here, or maybe even previously as the executive, I mean, I know working with you, we went through books, things like that. So what are some of the major moments, like a retreat or book or meetings? What are some of those major things that you've done or that you are doing that has helped, you know, develop your staff, your team?
Well, there's so many resources that we have for those in ministry or those that are leading ministry teams or churches or para organizations, and you're so thankful for all of those great resources and great leaders. I mean, we have now podcasts available like what you're doing and so forth, and those are so good. But I think, like, for me, there's been all sorts of books that I've read. I love Larry Osborne's stuff. Craig Rochelle and Andy Stanley and Patrick Leonsi, and there's so many, and some of it we've done as a team, and then there's things that you've read on your own. But I think A Tale of Three Kings is an incredible book.
Yeah, for sure.
And I remember as an intern they made me read this book, and I'm like, this doesn't make any sense. What is this? And then as you go through ministry and you experience things, there's things that you begin to realize, you know what? I want to be about the presence of God more than the position. Because if we get so consumed by the position, we'll miss the presence and we'll become Saul instead of David. And I think as ministers, we got to make sure that we make it about the presence more than the position, more than titles, but who he is. And even when spears are thrown at us or things are done, whether we cause them or not, we learn from our mistakes, but we just keep playing the harp. And I think that's a book that I just encourage, whether you're just fresh off the farm or you've been in for 30 years or more. That's an incredible book by, I think, Gene Edwards.
Yeah.
And then Leadership Pain by Dr. Sam Chan is
for sure.
incredible book, because as pastors, we all want, or as leaders, we all want the benefits. We all want the blessings, but we don't like the brokenness. And I think in order to experience the blessings and the benefits that God has for us, sometimes you have to give up to go up. Sometimes you have to go through pain in order to get growth. And I think that I remember when I first came to this church, I gave a copy to every board member to realize that, hey, as we do what God's called us to do, it's not all mistletoe and snowflakes. It's thorns and thistles and highs and lows and ups and downs. But through it all, God has a purpose behind the pain. And so I think those are some great resources that have helped us as a team and stuff like that.
Yeah. So has there been a time in your ministry or even your personal life where something that may have looked like a failure has actually set you up for success?
Well, I think any time that you deal with change or dealing with things, as a pastor, I love people, and I've always loved people. And sometimes when you do what God's called you to do, unfortunately, not everyone's going to get on the bus. And when that happens, it's because you love people. You don't want anyone to get off the bus. Sometimes you'll pull off the side of the road and try to get those 15, 20 people to get back on. But you've got hundreds and hundreds that are like, why is the bus stopped? And so there comes a point in time where you just have to realize that not everyone's going to get on the bus, and you have to love them, you have to bless them, you have to pray for them. And in those times where you feel like people have left the bus, you can look at those things and realize that that's the worst thing that can happen to you. But sometimes God, when you hold people with an open hand and you realize they don't belong to you, they belong to God, even your staff. God can take that situation that might be painful and that may not look like a success and turn it into, that might look like a failure, but turn it around to a success. And sometimes you may not see it in that moment, but as you continue to remain faithful to what God calls you to do, you'll look back in that time where you felt like a failure, or like, oh man, why, this isn't what I dreamed of, or this is what I thought was going to happen. But you look back and it humbles you, because you realize that everything that is done it's the Lord's. The Lord. This is the Lord's church. It's not my church.
Yeah.
And I think the bottom line is, it's one of those things that when you look back, in those times when you feel like you failed, whether it's in a personal ministry or it's with a budget or whatever it may be, you learn from your mistakes, you grow from them, and you humble yourself. And I think that's what God says, like, oh, now that you're now completely trusting me, now watch what we can do together, because you're all trying to do it on your own.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of those things where sometimes God, just has to humble us, and we learn from our mistakes, we grow from them. And even if you haven't done anything wrong, you just know that God has the ultimate plan.
Yeah.
And as long as you walk in obedience, and as long as you're faithful, he'll turn that faithfulness into fruitfulness in his time, even when you feel like you failed. Abraham Lincoln failed so many times, but he kept on pursuing, and then he became one of the greatest presidents we ever had.
Yeah.
Thank God he didn't stop after like so many failures of trying to even be on Congress or whatever it may have been.
Yeah.
So it's like, I think the key is you just, in the midst of your failures, in the midst of your downs, you just got to keep going forward and reminding yourself that 1 plus God equals the majority, not the minority.
Yeah. So, sermon prep. Everyone's doing it.
Yeah.
It's coming every week.
Yep, it does.
So what are you doing? What does that look like for you?
Well, I think the key for me is I'm a sermon series guy. So we either do a 4-week series or an 8-week series, and we just kind of pray about, like, Lord, where's our culture at? What's going on in our churches? and you just start praying about, certain things, and start looking at certain things that are happening in our culture and how that relates to the scriptures. Like right now we're doing a series on the seven churches in Revelation, and we're calling it Trends because what we've seen in the church of the then and there, the similarities are happening in the here and now. And so I think when it comes to those types of things is you pray, and then you begin to develop a plan. And then when you begin to develop a plan, you start studying, and you start looking at the scriptures, you start researching and so forth, and then you start developing your points and your scriptures that go with it. And then you start developing the things that have happened personally, maybe in your life, or in what the scriptures have happened through the history of where that church was at and so forth. So it's a lot of work. I know that the pastor that I worked with in Lancaster, he probably spent, 30, 50 hours a week on his messages, and they were phenomenal. And I think on the average, the average pastor probably, I know for me, it's between 10 and 15 hours a week.
Yeah.
So it's a lot of work. It's, you don't want to be doing it at Saturday night at 9 at night. That's drama. But you pace yourself, and you try to get ahead of the game. And of course, there's things that happen in our culture that even if you have a series planned, or you plan the year out, that God speaks to you and says, no, you're going to do it on this. And so, like, even in the middle of our 7 weeks of trends on the book of Revelation, the churches in Revelation, we took a 2-week breakout for Voices of Revival, where we talked about, after our 21 days of prayer, like, we just were believing for God to do something, to outpour His Spirit. So in the middle of the trends of seeing the church of the then and there to the here and now, we decided to say, hey, let's talk about what God wants to do now. And then we went back into, we're going to continue the series for the next 2 weeks and get it done.
That's great.
But there's those moments too, and you have to be willing to be flexible and say, hey, even though we're planning ahead and we're doing what we need to do, there's times that God will speak to you and say, hey, I want you to do this instead.
Yeah, so are you planning series kind of like case by case, or are you mapping them a few months out?
Oh, a few months out. Our ultimate goal is, for us, every church is different, but we try to plan out in September and on October what we're going to do for the entire year of next year.
Okay.
And, every church is different, but for me right now, there's 4 things that are non-negotiable in that 12-month, or however it goes, whether it's for 4 weeks or it's for 2 months in that series. But, vision, casting vision, not only for you personally, but for the church. Stewardship, compassion is another one that we're doing in marriage and family. So we know that's the ultimate goal. God can do whatever He wants. But we always, for now, out of the 12 months, we know 4 months are going to be focused on those 4 things, and then it's whatever else the Lord begins to speak into our hearts that our people need, that our culture needs.
Yeah.
Whether it's topical or it's a book of the Bible or whatever it may be, or it could be, on the armor of God or the fruits of the Spirit, or the Beatitudes. We've done that, and so that's like an 8-week series and stuff like that, or the 7 deadly sins. And so some of those things go for 2 months. It just depends. I know some guys, they'll spend one book the entire year, and it just depends on what God's told them to do. And as you get older, sometimes instead of doing one message and a different message, you start doing things different. Instead of becoming about topics, you begin to become more verse by verse.
Gotcha.
And I think that just happens as you get older and you start developing different patterns.
Yeah. So you mentioned earlier having a view for the city, and I know that's a big passion for yours. So what are some things you're doing? What are you involved in some groups? What's kind of that view? How does that play out for you, having a city view?
Well, I think for me, when I first came to this church, I wanted to meet with city officials to know, when you heard City View Church, what came to your mind. Because I believe that a church should not be known just for their location, which we have a great location right off the freeway, and we're thankful for that. And all of us have geographical locations of where the Lord's placed us. But if you were to ask the city officials, what is your church known for, and they couldn't say nothing, then that means that if your doors were to close, they wouldn't be like, no, not that church. No, we need them. And I want to be known for our heart more than our location. I want it to be like if we had to close our doors, they would be like, no, not your church. And so when I met with them, I just asked them some questions. I met with the chief of the fire department, and I met with a couple of other dignitaries in the city. I met our city council person from our district here in Mission Valley, and I just wanted to hear what they had to say. And so, when you kind of hear what you're known for or what you've done in the past or what you're doing in the present, those are all great, good things, but you realize, what, we can do more than that, and so what you just start doing is you just start praying, Lord, what are the needs in our city? And if you don't know what the needs in your city are, just ask the principal at the school. Just ask the chief of police, if you can meet with them. And the things are overwhelming. You can't do everything, but you can do whatever that one thing is that God calls you to do. And so for us, we have a big military presence here in San Diego because of our Navy bases and all that. And, you could look at the military and say, well, they're only going to be with you for 1, 2, 3 years, and then they're going to transition. But it's a mission field. And then there's people, too, that are actually moving into California. They're not leaving, or they're staying. And so you just realize, what, our desire has got to be to serve God's interest in the lives of others, however that may be, whether that's in cleaning up a school, which we've done. As a matter of fact, in our Compassion series, we take that we do a 3-part series, and on the 4th Sunday of that month, instead of having church, we go and be the church.
Oh, that's great.
And so we go clean up a school, and some people could say, well, you could do that on a Saturday, and we may do that on a Saturday someday, but it blows people's mind when we're down at the beach cleaning up, or at Dog Beach giving people water bottles and giving their dogs a bone, or a ball or something like that, and they're like, wait a minute, y'all are a church and you're not in your building, but you're coming to us. It blows their minds.
Yeah,
and
that's
so
great.
I think for me, it's building relationship with city officials, with the movers and shakers in the city, and developing relationship with them, and just saying, hey, what can we do collaboratively to serve God's interest in the lives of others? And even down below us, there's a huge suburban village that's being built on 200 plus acres, and they're expecting once it's all said and done, about 12,000 people to move into that area. And so we've just started, serving them. And we did, normally we do a big Easter outreach here at our church. We took it down to them.
Oh, wow.
For not only Savita, but for Mission Valley. And I think we had almost 2,000 people for our first time to ever do it. And the representatives of that planned community were so blown away by what we did that they want to help us next year, because they said in the history of, they have a park that was built and all this other stuff, but it's still being developed, the whole thing. They said, in all the years that this thing has been here, there has never been anything like this, to where people couldn't even find a parking spot. So,
Wow.
they want to help us out. And so it's just, it takes time, it takes consistency, it takes building trust,
Yeah.
and making them realize, listen, we're here to serve. And I think that's the most important thing, that people understand that we're here to serve them, not to be served. And when they know that, and you've allowed those deposits to be hidden in their hearts, then that gives you the door to become influential with them, because they know that you care for them.
Yeah.
It's about being connected more than corrected at that time. And
Yeah.
so as that's happening, we're seeing the Lord do some great things. And like the AT&T commercial, the guy, it's happening, we're seeing it start to happen, but it doesn't happen overnight. But you got to keep on pressing on, and eventually God will start turning that faithfulness into fruitfulness.
Yeah, I think when we talk about reaching the city, it's definitely a long play.
Oh yeah. And because it's a long play, your desire needs to be there for the long haul. I think when I look at any history of a church that I've been in, the success has been longevity. And, of course, this is my first lead pastorate, and God willing, I like it to be my last one 25 years later, but it's in the hands of the Lord.
Yeah.
You can't promise people that, hey, I'm going to be here 25 years.
Yeah.
But I think what gives you favor in a city and with a church and with a community is longevity.
Yeah.
And for me, that's all I've experienced. I was at one church, the pastor was there for 20 plus a year.
Yeah.
The other church I was at, 20 plus a year. I'd never been in a situation where I had to put my resume down on the guy's desk, whoever came in next, or, go through a pastoral search. Every place that I've been at, they've been there for that long, or they're still there.
Yeah.
So I've been under great leadership to learn that longevity speaks volumes.
That's great.
And that I think is the key too, is if you can continue to plow the field, because as Tom Rainier says, your first year is your honeymoon phase, you can do no wrong. Your second and third years is conflicts and challenges. Your fourth year and fifth year are crossroads. People are trying to decide are they in or out. And if you can endure all that stuff, years 6 through 10 is harvest.
Wow.
And the reason most pastors don't get to that is because they can't endure years 2, 3, 4, 5. So if we can just be consistent to the call that God's made on our lives, harvest is just around the corner. And then year 11, the change is not the church, the change is you.
Yeah.
Are you willing to change what was successful for the new wineskin that God wants to do for the next 12 to 15, 16 years?
Yeah.
So it's a constant battle. It's not the church at the beginning. All of a sudden, it's you.
Yeah. Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So, in your own life, what are some things that bring you renewal?
Tamales. No, I'm kidding.
A good tamale goes a long ways.
Yes, it does. It does. I think for me, I've always loved the outdoors. Even though I'm not able to do as much as I'd like to, but there's just something about being, whether it's at the beach or the lake or the mountains. Though I'm not big on skiing, I don't know if you understand what the NHL stands for. It does not stand for the National Hockey League. It stands for the Non-Hispanic League, because you don't see a lot of Mexicans on ice and on snow. But I do tube. I do a mean tube. So I think the bottom line is it's just being out there with nature is really a cool thing to do, and just trying to do things with my family. I think when you're younger in ministry, you're so goal-oriented, which is good and important, and even at 48, I'm still goal-oriented. But as you get older, it goes from goals to legacy. And I think if there's a way that we can bring balance to both, I think that's a good thing. Because you could be all about legacy and not want to see God do things. It's all about you. But I think you got to have a balance of both. So I think, at my age now, as I'm getting older, it's about what am I going to leave behind that people are going to remember more than the programs or the revitalization or the remodeling, those types of things. It's the impact of what you did for the life, to where that person says, he visited me when I was in the hospital. He called me when 4 months later after my wife died. They're not going to remember a message or the 6-part of a 7-part series. It's those things that they'll remember. So I think for me, I love sports. It's one of those things that that just refreshes me, and being with friends. I'm definitely an extrovert, so I love people and I get energized by them. So those are some things that really refresh me.
That's great.
And of course a tall cold glass of horchata goes a long way.
Well, hey Troy, thank you so much for sitting down with us and sharing. So great to just hang out with you and your team today.
Likewise, man.
And to just your friendship is so valuable to me, and your insights are always great. So thank you so much for
it's an honor,
what
brother.
you shared. So looking forward to another episode of the podcast coming up soon, guys. Thank you so much for listening in.